Yeah, but I hope it doesn't sound like that to the people.
Oh, no, I think that now there's just feedback.
Yeah.
Because they're watching this.
And I think that's one thing that we should do, like try not to, and one of the things is you are playing in the same computer that you are streaming.
Yeah.
I remember that some time ago that was one of the things that happened, and the video comes with the feedback. So it's just like,
so just keep it on mute.
Yeah.
Alright, that's fine. We gotta go to the other rooms. And the
Can you take it off?
Yep. The computer is still locked, and there's no,
yeah, there's no pattern.
I've tried to press enter and
No.
yeah, it's not passing.
Bitch. Wait, the iMac? Oh no, that's, you go to Wirecast.
Well, no, you can hand it over to someone else, but yeah, thanks.
你们应该多一些，因为平时类似于你学生，但我们第一次上课啊，哎，我以为哎，我跟你说，这课程对你绝对的，不是的，每一个课程它最后不是要，比如说招聘，你要做一个 presentation， 你至少要10分钟是吧？你上做一个5 minutes， 你做那个 poster， 今天有 poster， 就在这个老师他反正去转转，他我的下一个字，很小的事情，对。对，我跟你说，我好累呀！我前天刚回来，昨天就是刚睡了一下，今天早7点就起来，然后就懵逼的不行。但我觉得，哎呦，不是还有作业吗？那我觉得后来今天会。我爸完全回来背回电脑去了，我不好，看 reading， 但是觉得很。对呀，是啊，干嘛干嘛？但人真的特别少，我觉得人有点少，但是而且都是中老年人啊，不是，但其实安全感很强，那还蛮安全的。哦，就是安全都挺好，而且是就是你出去沙滩，然后一般东西放它也不沾你的，你知道吗？不要晒着，就是你自己的东西放啊，或者是你采访啊，都没有人会放，因为人少，所以东西多，大家即使上到也不会。对，就是那个 very yellow 的那个海滩，因为你一般去的话，他就默认你是去海滩或者是去哈瓦那首都，如果你要去其他地方，是要专门的，因为我是买了一开始是旅行社的，叫 Holos， 还有一个 Holos 就是他的不是，那 agency 在加拿大。然后还有一个就是
Oh, cool. ESL.
So what's the
I don't
difference?
know the acronyms.
Oh yeah, sorry. So like, what's the difference between teaching English as a second language and English as a foreign language?
Foreign language.
And we often kind of take it as an either or. Like, okay, so immigrants who come to Toronto, they're learning ESL as a second language, but you know, random students in Russia, they're learning English as a foreign language.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, but it's also kind of really mutable right now because you know the student in Moscow, you know, they moved to London, so now it's English as a second language, or
yeah,
you know, or students in Quebec, like
right.
That's a real like, is it English as a second language or foreign language?
Yeah.
So there's different methodologies and expected learning outcomes and
interesting.
Yeah, it's
yeah, that's very interesting. So wow, I didn't realize there were such big differences between these two.
But social media is a really interesting part for ESL, I think, just because of the way it connects language partners.
Yeah.
There's like so many. There's now. It's a new thing. I just got a free complimentary membership, but I haven't activated. It's basically Tinder, but for language partners.
Oh really? Oh,
and it's just like creating social media language partners.
Very cool.
It's called Amicumi. Anikumi, I think that's how I pronounce it.
Wow.
But yeah, it's just
That's
like everyone's all about, and like there's a language school in Brazil that corrects celebrity tweets. It's so
Yeah.
interesting, like just what it's done. So like we're all very keen to like, hey, if Facebook is addicting, well, how can you get
People are addicted to learning languages.
yeah, how can we use that for English?
Well, a very interesting platform is called Lake. Are you familiar with that?
I've heard of it.
It's kind of a multimedia platform for language learning. I haven't been on it in a while, but it's
It's supposed to be. Private said it is.
Right now?
Just in this room. We have to
Oh,
face the
okay, yeah, I definitely heard that. There's so many Google Classroom.
Is your name tag?
yeah, it's hard to keep up. Some of them are more generic. This one's like really about not only language learning, but sort of like what you're talking about, the tutor for language learning. But it's more comprehensive that it supports the language learning process and it has like a crowdsourcing aspect to it where you can contribute content, you have points. And you can use your points to have a tutor, a person tutor you. So it's cool that way. You could also buy it if you just want the tutoring. You don't have to contribute, like you can take a financial contribution or
Good, excellent. No, I'm sure you are. I've okay.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. I would like to welcome, on behalf of myself, my name is Bojana Krasmanovic, and I'll be co-chairing the symposium along with my dear colleague Anne-Laurie. It's a great honor to have you here, and welcome to our 2018 symposium. We worked hard to make this happen, and we hope that you will enjoy it as much as we enjoyed working on it. So, without further ado, we are proud to have a keynote speaker brought to us by the Canadian Association for the Study of Adult Education. And we would especially like to thank Constanza Silva, Quebec Regional Executive Member of the Association, for making it all possible. Daniel Burrell is an Executive Director of the Institut de Coopération pour l'Éducation des Adultes, ICA. Prior to this, he served as adult education policy analyst at ICA for 15 years. Daniel Burrell is a member of the Education Sectorial Commission of the Canadian UNESCO Commission and chair of the Adult Learning and Education Working Group of the Commission. Mr. Burrell is a
I wonder if we might have to use the main computer to stream. I don't think it's automatically connected. Let's sign in for me first. I'm worried if I sign in, it'll screw with the mainstream. You know, like it'll log itself out. So for now, I think we have to activate on the main computer. So we'll leave the streaming as is, and when the keynote speaker is done.
Specialist in adult education policy and the right to adult education. We're honored to have you here. So I'm just going to let you take over from here. This session is going to last for 45 minutes. After that, we will have a 15-minute question and answer session. So enjoy.
Thank you. I don't have a PowerPoint, so it's going to be the old way, the oral way. So it suits well adult education and it suits well my topic.
No speaker is done. We'll go in.
I think, are we live already?
Yeah, you can watch it.
Okay, I forgot about the other recording camera, so we need the. Oh. Okay. It's also. Do we have another extension cord?
Yeah, lots.
Okay. Because we need one for the video.
Alright. And I think we can only activate the other two screens from that computer, so we'll have to. Oh, you know what? I can probably.
Which is about adult education history. What's the password? Okay. Just a few presentation about ICEA and that will allow me to introduce the topic about adult education history and why we're having a special project this year about adult education history. First of all, English is my second language, and Saturday morning it's gonna take me about 5-10 minutes to switch to the Anglophone part of my brain. ICEA is an organization that celebrated in 2016 its 78th anniversary. So it's been created in 1946, but before, so it's another century and it's another era, the 40s. And before that, it was the French-Canadian committee of a Canadian organization that was called the Canadian Association for Adult Learning. It's been the Francophone committee for 36 to 46, and after like a lot of organization in Quebec, it became independent. And had a sovereignty association with the Anglophone community, like it happened in unions, organization, and a lot of organization. This is our website, icea.qc.ca, so you'll see on it different features about the history of adult education. And at the end of my presentation, I'll introduce you a website that we put online on the history of adult education in Quebec. And there's a timeline to it, so all the dates that I'm going to mention, they're from the timeline, so you don't have to take notes. Sadly enough, that this timeline is in French. We don't have the money to translate it, but if some of you have found, we'll be really glad to translate it. It's part of our idea, but it's a money thing. We looked for a way to celebrate our 78th anniversary, but not just talking about our own organization. We saw that the history of ICEA during the 40s till now was intrinsically linked to the history of adult. adult education in Quebec. So we decided, instead of only talking about our own history, to celebrate our 70th anniversary talking about the history of adult education in Quebec. So that's the root of our focus on the history. The title of my presentation, and it's the main conclusion that we draw, that the adult education has a very rich and long history in Quebec, like in Canada. In Quebec, Francophone, Anglophone community, but it's not known. Especially that the word adult education is relatively new. So people were doing adult education without naming it adult education. So the history work on adult education has a lot of unearthing to do. To put the word adult education on things that weren't named like that when they happened. So a lot of my take on the adult education history in Quebec is a reconstruction, like university work, theoretical work. A reconstruction retrospectively. I'm going to call adult education, I'm going to call some phenomenon adult education that weren't named like that before that in the 19th and 18th and 17th century, because it didn't exist. My presentation has four topics. I'm going to look at the history through two themes: domain of learning, what was put forward as learning needs for adult, from the 17th century going till or the 20th century. Site of learning, and you'll see that there was a lot of site of learning in the 19th century, especially in the Anglophone community and the Francophone community. I'm going to look a bit on policies, adult education policies, taking the word really largely because they weren't making adult education policy in the 19th century, even if they were at the end of the 1880s. A law creating evening classes for adults. So it was kind of a policy we would say today, but it wasn't talked about like an adult education policies that say would be an anachronism to, you're gonna have to fill the, if I'm creating English words that don't exist, just update your dictionaries. And ends with perspectives about where are we now? What is the history we're creating now in terms of adult education? And my idea would say that we're probably witnessing a deep change that I would call it a new paradigm going forward based on what has been created in the past 50 years. So I'm starting. If you go on the ICEO website, you'll see here, Histoire de l'éducation des adultes, History of Adult Education. If you click on it, I'll detail the website later. But at the end of the first page, there's a timeline. Like a diaporama timeline. So all the dates that I will be mentioned are from that timeline, basically. In terms of the domain of learning, we could say that the first topic of adult education, it's what I will call the long walk to answer adult basic learning needs. And it started with literacy. It's interesting to see when you collect dates and events that, first of all, just to start at the beginning, we could say that in our land, the beginning of adult education was First Nation adult education, when they were teaching themselves how to live in our ecosystem. When the colonizer came, we could say that the beginning of adult education and after the colonizer came was First Nation teaching colonizer how to live in our ecosystem, how to hunt, what to hunt, how to go through winter. And at the same time, colonizers started to teach First Nations about their own culture, their supposedly civilized culture. So the beginning of adult education, we could say, the history of adult education is
was working so well. Everything was good.
Hello, are you like first presenting?
No, I'm presenting at 11:10, but I'm just a little like.
Oh. Come on, you should go and watch the
I want to practice.
And I'm pretty sure you've practiced.
Yeah, but I have to re-angle it.
You are ready.
Thank you. I got great feedback on my defense. I mean, there were limitations with the study, but I was so happy I wasn't too giggly. They say you were well poised up there. I was like, what? Get out. I was like, hi. Bye. Okay, so I got to go onto Facebook and tell everybody to stream it.
And the other two streams are live. Okay. We'll just wait till the break. That way, if we lose the stream or something bad happens, it won't interfere with this talk. Okay. And then we're good to go.
I'm like really dinosauric, Jurassic. I rarely go on Facebook.
So you just have to tell them to go to .concordia.ca. Mm-hmm. They click here. Mm-hmm. And yes. Works perfectly, like a dream.
You went to the website?
Okay. From the website.
Okay, I'm happy.
Oh, I'm happy too. This is already 1,000,000 times better than last year. Everything on time, on schedule. Yes. It looks good. So surprisingly, the 100-foot Ethernet cord is bust. That one works fine. And I gave the total tangled up one to Danielle.
Oh, so you have already replaced it?
Well, yeah, that's our spare.
Okay, awesome.
That one works. Okay. So this computer is good to go.
Okay.
So it's all good. You can look at it. It says it's streaming, but right now it's streaming to nowhere. We have to activate it on YouTube. But I'm worried if we log in on YouTube on one of these computers, we'll lose the signal on the main one. Okay. And since the main one is the only one with the full version, in the future, we should put the main one at one of these computers.
Okay. Yeah.
That way we can we don't worry. We can do stuff while the keynote is there.
Yeah.
But now we know. Now you go on the Facebooks and you tell all your friends to like and subscribe.
Is that it? Go to doe.com.
No. Katie, I have you on the Facebooks, right?
On the Facebooks, I don't know. I know.
Katie. No, I have many Katies, but you're not one of them.
BOODHO. You and Anne are friends on DHOO.
DHO. Oh wait, why am I invited? Okay, I do have you on Facebooks. I just don't. You're just not on the Messenger. There, I sent you the link.
Excellent.
And I invited you to Facebook Messenger.
Okay, I won't do Facebook Messenger. Sorry.
You don't do it?
No. Can you just post it to my page?
No, do it yourself.
Oh my god.
It's on my mind.
GSDE 2018.
When do I present?
You present after me, I think 11:35.
Oh, not come stream live. Come see our live stream.
Yeah.
Yes. I feel like such an old person. Come see our
Thank
live
you.
stream.
That makes me feel better.
Okay.
Come see our
Live stream of.
Yeah, come see our.
Yeah, that's what I did.
Live stream. Okay.
Yeah, just like and subscribe.
Graduate Symposium. So I gotta put Department of Education too. Do I have to put Department of Education?
I didn't bother.
Oh, okay.
These are just my friends, right? So.
Okay. Of the Graduate Symposium.
What? No. Create. What is this? Sets. Freak off. Post. I don't want a set. I just want the words on my Facebooks.
See? Mission accomplished. Is that what I was supposed to do?
Yep.
Now I shall rehearse.
Yeah, I didn't rehearse at all. I'm gonna basically make it up.
Oi.
Yeah, but I'm pretend in charge, so I can just tell the person to wait their turn.
You're hilarious.
What's the point of doing all of this if you can't make the rules up when it counts for you?
Ah, I see. That's your angle.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say any more because technically we're live streaming.
Oh, so they're hearing us right now?
Nah, it's not. So the stream goes to the internet and to our YouTube site, but until we activate it on the YouTube channel, it's not activated.
Okay.
So it basically is going nowhere.
Oh, okay. So why are we calling it a live stream if people can't see it right now?
They can see the keynote. That one is on and good to go.
Okay.
These ones, because we need to use that computer and we might lose signal for a second, we're going to wait for the break to activate that one.
Oh, okay.
Or to activate these two.
So it's not activated yet, right?
Your room is not.
Great.
No. You can do anything you want, but it is the internet.
So I won't dance on the tables today.
No swearing, no nudity, nothing you wouldn't want your parents to accidentally see in 10 years.
You make me laugh because that's totally not I.
Good.
Oh, I need a friggin' pencil. Ugh.
That is now peer-to-peer learning. And it was viewed as a good methodology to have people teach each other, workers teach each other. But there's a renewal of peer-to-peer learning in our days, and in a really structured way. But at that time, mutual education started to be a movement around the middle of the 19th century. Public conference. It was an amazing part of, with putting words retroactively, an amazing part of adult education in the 19th century, the middle of it, public conference. At l'Institut Canadien, in the different libraries, a lot of people would give public lecture, and often about liberalism, the new enlightenment, the new political ideas. They would give public lecture then, and it was a main part of adult public education was to assist to those public lecture. I saw one mention of that, but I think it was interesting to highlight it. Traveling philosopher. One writer wrote in 1850 that there was traveling philosopher in the cities, like in the time of the Greek, just coming, and I haven't seen traces of how it took shape. Were they on the street corner or just getting in libraries and just starting to talk? But there was a mention of traveling philosopher. The YMCA movement, the creation of it and the structuring of it was part of an adult education institution. Sunday school, from the biblical teaching and the religious part, is part and during the 19th century. Newspaper, there was a proliferation of newspaper in the 19th century in Quebec, stemming from the intense political debate. And you had a lot of newspaper, and those newspaper were teaching people. You had, like, not only through the editorials, but they were really sound to call adult education policies initiative in the 19th century. But there was part of the state-based creation of an infrastructure on education. And right in 1801, a bill was tabled, creating, and just try to imagine what Quebec would be right now if that thing had been put into place. A bilingual, non-confessional school system, 1801. Bilingual, non-confessional school system. It's totally the inverse of everything that had happened after for 200 years. But that bill was just pushed aside by the Catholic Church. It never got voted. Was viewed as an assimilation tool and whatever. But sometimes I try to imagine if in 1801 we had been a non-conventional bilingual school system, what would be Quebec right now? Would be assimilated, or would be the most bilingual population of the world, mixing the two cultures? It's fiction, but at the end of the 18th century, a report on education was tabled, and we saw different moments in the first half of the 19th century. A lot of committee structure report on education that highlighted the high level of ignorance, the need for basic. So there was a state-based reflection on the need to put into place a school system and the need to give basic education to the youth and not to adult. But that historically, the law for mandatory schooling, the first law was tabled in 1840. It took a century before it got adopted. The mandatory school law in 1641, I think. 1941 was adopted a century later. So the history of creating a state-based basic needs, basic educational need was a long fight for youth, and it was also for adults, and we're still fighting for it in a sense. We saw in the 19th century a lot of call for the need to create a modern school system, the lack of basic education for the population, and it was a strong part of the patriot discourse. The second half of the 19th century gets complex because the church took so much place in the school life. Was a confessional-based school system controlled by the church till the 1960s when the education ministry was created. But we saw in 1831 the creation of a permanent committee on the Chamber of Lower Canada, the Assembly of Lower Canada. We saw in 1859 the creation of un Conseil de l'instruction publique, a formal structure dealing with education within the Lower Canada state. And for a few times at the end of the 19th century, a Ministry of Education was created for a few years. But the Conservatives, it's interesting because the role of the state in education was viewed as a negative thing, was viewed as an indoctrination. The state will take our kids and teach them modern ways, liberal ways. They'll become atheists. They won't believe anymore. So we cannot give any confidence to the state to deal. And we don't want the state to deal with education. So that brought the closing of that first experiment of a education ministry. And in the 60s, Paul Gérin-Lajoie, who created the education ministry, had to take back the law when it was tabled, because people were afraid that the yellow school bus would steal their kid and bring them to the cities and teach them ways, modern ways that are not the ones of the families. Even in the 60s, the same argument was there. We can't trust the state. And you see it also, the creation of the Human Rights Declaration in 48. Then the debate, I mean, the state was the German Nazi state at the time, so people had a strong reaction to giving the state total control in matters of education, because the state had showed what it could do during the Second War when you give them the power of education. If we look now at the 28th century, I'll go faster on this one because it's more familiar to what we know. We saw a lot of the beginning of what is now the establishment of adult education. The cooperative movement, les caisses populaires, did financial literacy, we would say right now, basic financial, the unions and a lot of movement, the suffragette movement, women movement, had a lot, the social movement had an adult education component. And we saw that all through the first half of the 28th century. And there was new initiative in the 28th century, home-based classes through newspaper. People, like the agriculture structure and federation and organization would buy a page and do formation at distance learning. So you would have agriculture and people would read the newspaper, and it would be, it's the beginning of distance learning. Radio-based courses, right? At the beginning when the radio was created, the home-based school, the distance learning home-based school moved from newspaper to radios. Popular education offering. We saw also the first adult graduate program at George William College here, Concordia, but the first incarnation of it in 1936. So your university as a part of a modern adult education. A lot of vocational training policy, federal, provincial, the first framework of sharing adult vocational training was put into place in the 1930s between the federal and the provinces. So in those era, we saw what we know now: unions, civil social movement, and in the 60s, we saw another part of what's the established situation of adult education right now, which is popular education, literacy group, appeared in the 60s and are still active right now. And we saw from the 1960s till now a lot of policy development. Le rapport parent, the education reform in Quebec had a component. In the rapport parent, there's a chapter about permanent education that has a really modern tone to it, till the adoption of the adult education policies in 2002. Just to close on perspective, what we have now, it's the success of 50 years of adult education development. We have a public sector, secondary-based, and that's unique to Quebec. There's a high school for adult, state-based, college, universities, there's adult education, either all mixed up with everybody or a special adult ed program. We have a strong community-based infrastructure, literacy groups, popular education groups, and TVET community-based group, vocational education community-based group. There's a lot of associations that have educational program within them, unions. It's not their goal to teach, but they have structured and La FTQ as a college, and they do have. But right now, what we see is the emergence of something new. And I'm comfortable to call it a paradigm shift. There's a new chapter being written. First of all, based on the fact that 2/3 of the population in Quebec and in Canada has post-secondary education. It's the highest level in the OECD country. So we have 2/3 of the population who are autonomous learners. And they answer their need online, basically, or they're autonomous. They can by themselves. And you have 1/3 who are a bit aside of that. 25%, 20% of the 25 years old and more in Quebec don't have a high school diploma. There's still about, I would say 15 to 20% of the population are really marginalized in our knowledge society based on weak literacy needs or not having diploma. So we live in a polarized society. 2/3 of it can deal with themselves, us. We can deal with our learning needs. We know how to manage the systems and either go online. And there's the new face of inequality. It's not massive inequality like in the 60s. It's really marginalized people who are on the side of our society. And to close on that thoughts, what we could say, I don't think without too much exaggeration, but you can answer that, is in our knowledge society, knowledges and competencies have become conditioned for inclusion. You cannot have a job if you don't have specific skills. You cannot enjoy internet if you don't read. You cannot, a lot of what's natural and obvious for us is based on a certain level of knowledge and competencies. But it becomes also a factor of exclusion. Reading is a competence. If you don't have that competence in our society, I mean, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine that everything, internet, newspaper, everything, and it's hard to imagine that how to live. But my take would be maybe in our society, knowledge and competency becomes a factor of systemic discrimination. Society expulses you if you not, even if you don't have basic skills. But even now, if you don't have the right skill, you could have a diploma but not the right one for the economy. So it's not even the marginalized people with lower education that are systematically discriminated in our society, in knowledge-based society. If you don't have the right knowledge, even if you do have knowledges like diploma, but you don't have the right one, you'll be expulsed from the labor market. You won't find jobs, or you'll be overqualified for the job you're having. So our knowledge society, instead of making knowledges a factor of development, personal and social development, is transforming it into a factor, a cause of systemic discrimination. And that's unique. That wasn't the case. You could live your life in the 60s without reading. You can basically, I mean, we're saying now the workforce in Quebec, 40% of it is highly qualified, 40% is not qualified, and 20% is in the middle. So we have a polarized labor market. We have a polarized society based on the knowledge you have or you don't have. And that new paradigm is we have established formal, non-formal, organization-based, popular education groups and all that. There's a lot of peer-to-peer learning, self-learning, web-based self-learning appearing. Most of us probably fit that autonomous learner that deals with their team. And overall, we have a society based on knowledge that use knowledge as a discriminatory resources instead of an empowering and enlightening what adult education, humanistic discourse would say about it. I would leave it there. Just to, I want to have a moment, 15, 20 minutes with you just to answer and exchange and have your view also on my reading of the retroactively putting adult education label on things that weren't named like that at the time. So just thank you for listening.
So I would like to open the floor right now for the question and answer session. So feel free to ask, and I assume that it's going to be the basis for a very interesting discussion. So.
I noticed that you indirectly referenced the Quiet Revolution. I was wondering if you can contextualize a little bit more in your timeline and explain a little bit its direct effect on adult education. I know a little bit more on child education because that's my expertise, but I'd like to hear.
If you read in the Rapport Parent, the main policy paper that summarized and that structured that education part of the Quiet Revolution, there's a chapter on éducation permanente and permanent education. And it's interesting because it's if when you read it, it's well structured, so you can guess. I mean, if somebody was able to write so clearly, so modernly about permanent education, there was a history before. So there was something to write about, and not just created out of the blue. And we saw something important in UNESCO in 49 started a cycle of international conference on adult education, the Confintea conference, the International Conference on Adult Education. The first one was in 49. The second one was in Montreal in 1960. So if UNESCO gave to Montreal an international conference because there was a ground for it. There was a movement. There was people. There was communities of adult educators. And when you realize that in 1936 there was enough maturity for the adult movement in Canada to create a national organization, the Canadian Association, those things don't come first. They come after something existed. So there was a long history, structured and a known history. And La Révolution Tranquille, the Quiet Revolution, took the shape of the creation of a secondary institution for adults. There was Polyvalence, Cégep, the Quebec University system, but there was also the creation of a secondary adult education, des centres d'éducation des adultes, which is right now when you're 16 and over, you can finish your diploma, but also a department of adult education within the Ministry of Education. So they created the civil servant base that still exists till our days, but took different name, changed name along the time. So that's the more formal part of it. The other part, le réseau EQ, like l'UQAM, started to have classes at night. Four slot of classes, not only 3 during the day, but 1. So opened up the possibility of doing undergrad diploma at night. So that's the formal part of it. The other part of it was I did a summary of the member of Lycea from the 40s till the 70s. And we saw a lot of Catholic association of this, Catholic association of that. And in the 60s, they all disappear and becomes popular educational network of. So we saw the appearance of a popular education community-based, and the Marxist point of view on education, the more revolutionary point of view, education for social transformation. And we say that in the 60s. And those structures still exist in our days. So at the state level and at the civil society level, those two factors were an important change. But most of all, like what often happened with education reform, the government focused on the new generation and leave the adult aside. And the Quiet Revolution is a major example of that. They created Polyvalente, etc. They started with the new generation. And the last reform in the 90s they put it into place. They took one cohort, and when they went to grade 1, they changed grade 1, and they followed that cohort. So they changed the system for the next generation of adult, too often forgetting the actual generation of adults. So in a summary, that's those two main drivers: state-based organization and community-based organization. But in the discourse of Lycea, it's interesting to see in the 70s, they would ask for a counter-Quiet Revolution because the state took over. The state is the last one in adult education in Quebec. Civil society-based, community-based were there before. And we saw in the discourse of Lycea in the 70s the call for a counter-Quiet Revolution to just push the state aside a bit, that the state started to become the black hole of adult education dynamic. Everything was sucked to it. We still kind of are in that influence. Everything is state-based related. and all the groups are through subsidies. The subsidies are like hooked to the state, and we're still in that dynamic that the state is the last one to came in adult education, but it's the strong one right now, and it's hard to go away from state-based adult education.
Thank you.
Is anybody doing PhD work in adult education among you?
The last one who did it is Audrey Dahl, who is
Right.
now at UCAM, yeah.
Right.
And she looked at that, totally marginalized group. Yeah,
Right.
which is interesting, you mentioned radio at the beginning, Yeah, I think radio is still very strong influence, and the radio is being threatened also in terms of,
Right.
cutting subsidies and things. And, some of this work,
Right.
like some of Audrey's work, is related to people listening and making up their minds without knowing how to read.
Yeah, we saw like community-based radio or in a financial difficult situation right now. There's something, I don't know if I hope it's not a tendency, but I started to see writing about post-literacy world. In a world where video, in a world where people use more YouTube to web search than Google, and are we moving, and where computer would be voice activated, you don't even know, are we moving into a post-literacy? And one article I read really scared me, is probably Donald Trump is the first politician of the post-literacy era. Speaking short, everything that he does, he speaks like an adult educator with strong images, not arguments, with punch and using images. And probably that's another argument that adult education has a positive side and has also a negative side. But they're kind of scary reading of it, that moving towards video makes reading and writing not as important, even tutorial. I mean, people could just look at a video and learn how to do something instead of reading the manuals.
So it's just the point that you're saying about, you made an earlier point about knowledge being a factor of discrimination, and perhaps the post-literacy world will actually make things more equal, because I have seen people who have not absolutely no reading skill, but not in particular languages or unable to use a computer, fully learn things by just looking at videos. So they were able to pick up people who are very old, people who are very young, people who have not learned to read. So do you think that while it is scary, it would have these equalizing effects in the long run?
I think so. But adult educators have to put the positive spin on it. Like computers at the beginning. I mean, like at different time. I mean, so because you have at the same time, political education becomes important. Like media literacy, if I put those words to it. Critical media literacy becomes important, because if people, I mean, we see it, like I was saying in a few days, that study about how fake news are disseminating themselves way quicker than real news. So people can access the content. That's one thing. That's more, they can participate more democratically to a political debate where there's real and fake. But there's another layer needed there. The media literacy becomes important. And what's interesting in all that, strangely enough, we're never talking about employability and work-based related education, but the government is only talking about that. Like media literacy, the importance of it for society, not only for people. Health literacy, the importance of it for society, not only for people. Financial literacy, etc., etc., etc. There's a new social demand for a lot of basic skills, important for individual, but society also. Intercultural education, etc. But the government is only talking about employability and work-based related. In the context of the issues and the importance of them, looking at it through that perspective of a wide extent of basic skill needed now, media literacy being one of them, the government policy looks irresponsible. Totally. Like we would say, I read a lot of report after the 2008 financial crisis, and they realized basically that even if there was fraudulent and creative derivative financial product. At the basis, people took mortgages and didn't know that they couldn't take them. They had lack of basic financial literacy. And people just fed on that. But at the core, if they knew, they wouldn't have taken them. So the whole system. So one person bankruptcy is not a problem. 100, 200, 1 million person bankruptcy becomes a social problem. Same thing for media literacy. One people not able to figure out what's real, what's fake, it's not a problem. 10,000, 100,000, at one point, it becomes a social problem. Racism is the same. One racist is not a problem, depending who's the victim of it. 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, people's individual incompetence become a social problem. And what we see now is the new, what we say, new social demand for basic skill, wide extents on different learning needs, financial, health, media, etc., 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 that just reflect the complexity of our society. It's just, we live in a society, and that's the real meaning for me of a knowledge society. It's not a society based only on high-tech knowledge. It's a society based on a diversified, extended, specialized type of knowledge, from media, intercultural, health, financial, etc. We can have a PhD and be a racist. We can have a PhD and be a bankrupt. We can have a PhD. So school-based learning is not a defining factor in that. We could have a lot of social and learning needs even if we have a PhD. So that society just leveled the playing field in terms of basic skill and didn't reduce it to a diploma. And that's in that context, literacy might move the way a bit and create a more equal possibility of accessing knowledge, but the counter level of it increase the needs and importance of media literacy and critical literacy and those cognitive skill, the soft skill, the 20th century skill becomes more important. And in that context, governments are doing employability-based policy for unemployed person. It's so tiny in the context of the needs, to the point that it becomes irresponsible to me. That's an editorial, by the way.
That's a very good editorial. I think you should publish it, put it in Huffington Post, that it goes on the YouTube and things like that. But again, even for me, when I said that, the last one was what Audrey did, Constanza is looking at MOOCs and looking at the MOOCs and then how the same thing is propagated, for example, in New York Times. It is this kind of, because it's at the margin of, like what you're talking about, how is it kind of shifting, changing, etc. The interesting thing, as I was sitting thinking that I'm on her committee, is to see if we can place it in some kind of adult education perspective. Yeah, she's looking at the technicality of it. Where do we see this? But then, what does it mean in terms of education in general and adult education in particular? Yeah.
I saw a hand somewhere at the back, but I forgot.
I was actually a similar question. When you brought up autonomous learners and this idea that if you have a high school diploma, you somehow are now able to be an autonomous learner. I was struck by that statement because I sort of had the idea that people who drop out of school are the ones who are forced to become autonomous learners. So what did you mean when you were talking about autonomous learning?
What do I mean? In the engineering of training, there are discriminated different things like being able to know your knowledge needs, being able to shop for an answer to your knowledge need, being able to all the sequence of knowing your needs, negotiating a site where you get an answer, and till the end where you transfer your new knowledges to your working with. But right now, an autonomous learner is somebody, and you recognize yourself unconsciously. You're doing that. You don't know something. You open the web, you find a YouTube tutorial, you go through it, you know it, and you put it into action. All those things are a specific function of engineering, learning engineering. Knowing, recognizing your needs, shopping for an educational answer to it, offering, going through it. You probably are looking at 3-4 different YouTube videos. This one, I don't really get it. This one is more my learning style. You get to it, and after you just close your computer, you do your things to put it into practice. So all those things, the autonomous learner right now do that unconsciously. Youth do that unconsciously. They just do it. So it's an amazing success of a learning culture. Sometimes we say we don't have a learning culture in Quebec. I would say I'm not totally sure, because that's an example where we have integrated so naturally what is specialities of learning engineering that we do it like that.
Do you feel that more something that people learn in school or something that's natural?
Right now, I think school are behind. I mean, a 5-year-old kid, I mean, they open the computer. I mean, a friend told me that his kid actually is talking to the computer to get the kids' program on YouTube. He never touches even for him, touchscreen is an old technology. It's voice activated for him. So imagine the mouse and whatever. It's voice activated. So in a sense, when a 3-year-old kid is able through voice activated computer to call in the programs he wants on YouTube, I mean, I'm old. I'm from the 20th century. Like in a sense, I'm a learner from another era. And that's what I mean. So it's not really correlated to diploma right now. That thing I think broke.
I agree. So the 1/3 who don't have high school diplomas, they could still very well be autonomous learners.
Yeah, I think they have to be for their own survival. The other part of that that's more a theoretical analysis. We live in a society that hierarchizes knowledges a lot. I mean, if you know how to play if you have the knowledge to play derivative instruments, you are some kind of a value knowledge or management, and you have a lot of knowledges that are not valued in our society, and that brings the movement of revaluing, recognition, reaffirming some knowledges, native knowledges, and UNESCO is really into that reviving knowledges. Before we close, I just want to show you the site. The site has 2 components. The timeline, and it's a basic timeline. You just go through it, and it's by chronological order. And we're asking different organizations to send us artifacts of their history. So that part here, people can upload artifact. And if you look at this one, this from 1889. It's from the Montreal Commission Scolaire, school board, Montreal School Board. It's the organization of evening classes. It's the document from the time. They just digitalize them and send them to us. So what we're looking right now is to enrich that part with artifact and enrich the timeline with dates. So if you have a history, if you are an adult education history buff, I want to meet you because I think there's not a lot of them, and I'm looking for them. But you can send us dates, and we'll add them up. Now it's really basic as a structure, but starting September, we'll look for funds to make it a permanent multimedia web-based encyclopedia on the history of adult education. That's more Quebec-based. There's a bit of Anglophone, also Quebec-based part of history. And the Francophone outside Quebec did the same thing with the same software. We'll just combine the 2 of them at one point and have a history of adult education in Canada and feeding it with everything that people are sending us. It's more collaborative-based initiative. So that's the tool that you can just see. You can access it on the page of l'ICA here, Histoire de l'éducation des adultes. And it would be a way to learn French as a 2nd, 3rd, or 4th language.
Well, just a little bit of an advertisement, I think. If you are not a member of ICEA, I encourage you to look at it and to look into becoming a member. There is lots of stuff you can do there. And you can really have impact, because the theme of this conference is impact, and that's one place that you can have impact. You can have impact in terms of enriching the organization base, but you can have impact in terms of all the advocacy they do vis-a-vis the government. So it's very important. And in many ways, therefore, also, since this is a CASAI-sponsored kind of lecture, I think look into becoming members of CASAI also, because it's a small organization, again, compared to AERA, for example. And therefore, it's very difficult to have impact on AERA, but it's much easier to have impact on CASAI, and it's Canadian, and it has a alternative American branch, and they meet every 4 years, they meet together. So it's an interesting, these are interesting outlets for you as starting in the field. So consider it. And the memberships are kind of, like $25 and stuff like that. So.
And we are assisting right now in a renewal of a new generation of people in adult education. You're the researcher part of it, but the board of ICEA, all the unions are there, community networks, and the age just dropped 15 years. Like you see, the 30, 40 years old generation is appearing in the field of adult education, heading the department of their organization, and there's a new generation of researchers in adult education, and it's important for you to take the stage, because practitioners are at just the nose, and through their action, they're not looking at widely to phenomenon and policies and all that. So researcher, that's their one of their main part of that, is to feed us with knowledges and understanding of global framework of and methodologies also, if I refer to the thesis, pedagogy, andragogy, let's say.
Yeah, and in terms of lifelong learning, things like nurseries, things like, daycare and stuff like that are very much part of that whole movie. The parents need that to go do their auto kind of education,
It's nice to spend my Saturday morning with you. Good luck for
Thank
the
you
rest.
very much, and thank you for the from us for you. And I would like to invite everyone for a short coffee break at our 5th floor lounge. It is going to last in 10:15. At 10:20, we have our morning presentations in this classroom and 2 classrooms across the hall. All the classrooms are clearly marked, and you have schedule everywhere in front of each classroom. Also, I would like to remind you that this event is live streamed. You can find a link for live streaming on our website, so GSDE Concordia, so you can share the live stream as well if you're interested in doing that. So just so you know. So enjoy the rest of the symposium. Thank you.
Have you been?
Je vais laisser pour l'instant, comme ça, si les gens veulent. Vous avez quelque chose?
Oui, merci.
Saturday morning, well worth it. I really enjoyed that talk. That was excellent.
And it's only like 10 in the morning or something.
Yeah, this is.
It's really interesting, and I mean, it's interesting, even though it's self-imposed education, but it's also a great lens just to look at cultural and social and economic elements as well as underlying cognitive. It's really, really interesting. I hope we can maybe send you some.
And I can also give you the URL.
What I realized is that within all the different sectors.
Oh my god, I had that for
To share the URL with some people that you want to watch a presentation.
Okay.
We tried making a very short.
That's the beauty of it.
I missed this part. Thank you. So I should go to.
No, that's very good, but sometimes you and thank you for sending the emails. You are absolutely
I will become a member. This is the best talk I've attended in I don't know how long. Usually like I go to keynote and I sleep after like surreptitiously.
Your email address is
RUBY.
Are you?
Yeah, no, it was excellent.
Can I go ahead and plug it in, Clint? And then when we come back,
They have so much.
I know. It's not even like
Just the political education, adult political education.
So I was like, oh, thank you.
The thing is, you have to.
BY at live.com.
At
live.com.
Okay, so you're live, And okay, this is Ravinder. I just put the subject Ravinder notes.
No problem.
Thank you, appreciated that.
Oh,
Ruby and how to pronounce Ruby?
Have the good lenses, theoretical lenses to go behind the word adult education. Whatever knowledge you have.
That's last name, first name, but generally I prefer
Ruby.
No, I prefer Ivan. It's like the thing is when I go back home, if anyone calls Ruby, it's going to be my dad.
Oh, okay.
So maybe in a few years I'll take over. For now, Ivan is fine.
And that's interesting way to put.
Yeah.
But you will take over the responsibilities, not the designation.
Do you know Apple products? What is it? I need to get my file. I don't know where to find it. That's what I'm using, right? For my presentation? Yeah. Yes, I don't know how to pop it. Where do I go for that? Oh, it's right on the desktop. Thank you. Yes, okay, thanks.
I'm glad I can help.
Yes, absolutely.
It's viewed as a language that you have to learn like your.
I have to do some.
I send you.
Okay, so are you going to be in this room or?
No, I'm going there. That's it. I'm done with this.
Okay, so it might take some 10 minutes.
It's okay. I'll check from you whenever I'll see you after 10 minutes.
No problem. That's awesome.
Okay.
Just breathe.
Almost. Believe me, I have other. make it on a what?
It's a Windows PPT.
Same with me, mine. Same with mine. I know. I don't know. I don't like Apple. This is why I can't figure it out. It's Apple.
Yeah, I mean, if we can get a clicker, like, can we?
Yes,
that a clicker?
that's okay for us.
Okay, great. All right. So we're here, and we want to go presenter view.